Well, it's another Monday morning, and I got a basic presentation that I put together. Some of you guys probably won't enjoy this as much as some of the others that are just getting started, but every now and then I like to kind of drop back and cover some basic stuff just because, and sometimes it'll make me think of a story I need to tell, sometimes it won't. But I'm going to jump into this thing and try to give you guys a little something you can chew on. So here we go. You may have comments about this. Hope you enjoy it. This is all the pieces and parts to a V8. You might recognize that one there is one of these GM engines, just because of your coil near plug thing, all the stuff laid out there. How many of you guys, when you take an engine apart, lay stuff out that pretty? That one's obviously was put out there to photograph. But a lot of times we don't think about how many parts are there. If you do it one piece at a time, it's kind of like these wiring circuits. And I used to have my students build these wiring circuits and wire things up. And you're basically doing it one wire at a time, but whenever you get through, it looks like spaghetti. I would even let other students watch them wire this stuff up, because you can't copy somebody else's work if you look at it at the end and it's just nothing but a big mass of wires. This thing right here, lots and lots of parts there. I didn't take the time to count them all, but you can imagine how many of them there are. Your configurations, your old one-cylinder engine, and you got a V-twin. Some of the old peanut picker engines around here used to be air-cooled Wisconsins. And then there you got one that was 3 cylinders, and you got an inline 4, you got 5 cylinders. You notice that? You notice you got 2 of them that are companions and another one over there in the backside too. And then it's just an odd configuration to me to have 5 cylinders, but some of your Acuras had them, some of your Chevys have got 5 cylinders, your inline Chevys do, and all. And there you can have V5s too. I don't know what has a V5, I've never run into one of those. V6, V8, boxer twin, and then your flat 4, and then your flat 6, Okay, so here are your long blocks. Here's a funny little story. One time there was a guy that was working at the Ford place. I was standing there talking to one of the truck mechanics, and this guy who was basically just a guy they'd hired to clean up or whatever, he came out of the parts room, and he came to me and my friend Philip, who was standing there talking, and he said, these guys in the parts room had asked me a question I don't know how to answer, and he said, I'm wanting to buy an engine for my wife's Aerostar, and can you come out here and look at her vehicle and tell me if it has a short block or a long block in it? And Philip looked at me and said, I'm going to let you handle this one, and then he walked off. But anyway, the guy didn't know what they were talking about when they said long block. A long block would be one with the heads on. Some of you might recognize this as a Volkswagen Bug, and then this one right here is your overhead cam. You can sell that because you only got 3 pistons, it's a V6, and right here you got a rotary engine, which I worked on those some whenever I was at the Mazda dealer back in the 80s. And then is your slant configuration engines. That is a slant configuration engine off of a out of a Dodge, an old Dodge Plymouth Valari, those Dodge Aspen, those cars, and they would have these slant engines in them. A lot of the other Dodges would too. Volkswagen engines, the 4-cylinder Volkswagen Rabbit and Golf engines, those are slant 4 engines, and the Toyota Camry, the ones that were with the timing belt, the late 90s, those were slant engines, because they didn't stand up straight, they were at a slant. And I guess that gave them a little bit longer stroke without having to have the hood being so tall or something. And then this one right here would be your, straight. That's a slant, but that's straight, but it's slanted over, Now, short block versus long block, your long block's going to come with the heads on it. Basically, that's how that's going to work out. And so that's basically, if you just build the bottom end and then you have the heads reworked and all that, and put those on there, you're going to have a short block over here. And they call that a rotating assembly a lot of the times when you're talking about that. And on a lot of these engines, like GM used to make the timing cover, if you ever pull the timing cover off, you had to replace it. Of course, there's your balancer and all that. Bore must be perfectly round and not tapered. Now the stroke, is the measurement between here and here. That determines how much the piston travels up and down, and then the bore would be how big around the piston is. But a lot of the times if you were rebuilding one, it was just smarter. I don't know how many times I rebuilt engines back in the 60s, I mean in the 70s and 80s, and we would just clean everything up real good and hone the cylinders to break the glaze, and we would throw rings and bearings in there on faith and get by just fine. But if you're going to do it right, you'll make sure that you mic the crank to make sure, or plastic gauge it at the very least if when you're finally putting it together, to see how much it squishes that plastic gauge out so you see how much oil clearance you got. The smart thing to do if you're going to build one up right is buy a crankshaft kit. When you buy the crankshaft kit, then you basically are going to get a set of bearings that are matched to that crankshaft. And you can do the bore the cylinders over, have it bored over by like 30 thousandths, not 10,000, 30 thousandths, because 30 thousandths over pistons are pretty easy to get. And if it's bored, it's a perfectly round hole. It's not tapered, it's not egg-shaped or anything like that. But if you're just throwing a set of rings in there without actually having it done right, you can wind up having trouble because of that. There's a machine shop over near here that does work for people all over the place, and this guy's really, really, really good at what he does. And instead of bolting his boring equipment on the deck of the head surface, on the deck of the block surface where the head goes to bore it, he actually has boring equipment that lines that bore up with the center line on the crankshaft, which is an incredibly expensive way to do it. But I'm telling you, that guy's an absolutely incredible machinist. Does some of the best work of that kind I think I've ever seen. Of course, he also does valve jobs and stuff like that too, and I've had some work done over there. But anyway, machine shops are harder to come by now. The stroke is determined by the crankshaft, not the length of the rod. You got to be recognizing that too. What's wrong with this picture right here? Okay, so you got a wrist pin here. The wrist pin usually has to be pressed out of there. It's actually pressed into the connecting rod. In some cases, you'll have the wrist pin you'll have little snap rings on either side of the piston, holding them in there. Volkswagen Bugs were like that. So it's fairly easy to take those apart and put them back together. But anyway, this right here, when you measure, put the ring in there, and you measure the ring gap. This is really important. There was a young fellow that was building an engine in my department one time, and I told him, you need to check that ring end gap. And he started to put it together without doing that, and I said, no, let's stop right now and check the ring end gap. So when we put those new rings in that cylinder, those rings had no ring gap whatsoever. If you don't measure that ring gap, and you put some in there that don't have ring gap, the engine will start up and it'll run a little bit until those wings swell up, and then the engine will stop running. That's a best case scenario. If you measure the ring gap and you don't have at least 1,000th or so of ring gap, or maybe 1.5 thousandths, then you need to take and foul those rings, the end of the rings in here, so you'll have some ring gap. That's important. Now, the place between here and there is ring side clearance. That's what you would measure if you were measuring old pistons. Most of the time, like I say, if you're going to bore it 30 over and put new pistons in it, you're not going to need to measure that anyway. But you will need to measure this. That is very important. There's a connecting rod, and there's a bearing down there. These ring gaps, these two compression rings, that does not need to be stacked. Those things need to be on opposite sides of the piston. If you do have them stacked, you'll have compression loss there, and that's never a good thing. Newer engines have low tension piston rings. You might remember some of your older engines that were sitting out there for a long time, and you go to try to start them up, and the oil's gone from the cylinder wall because over time it's all drained off. And those high tension piston rings engines used to have back in the day, you can try to spin them over, they go yeah, they spin real slow, be real aggravating. You have to squirt some oil down in there, try to get them lubed up where they spin faster and all that. Usually when it's been running, there's enough oil in there where you don't have that problem. But what will happen on those low tension piston rings is you wind up with one, if the cylinder walls get washed down, it'll sound like it's got no compression. And I've actually had them come in where used car people moved them from place to place until they washed the cylinder walls down. and I'd go out there with my work order in my hand, spin it over, sound like it needed a timing belt. Look at the timing belt, it would be perfectly in time. And I'd say, well, this comes from a used car lot. Let's squirt some oil on top of each one of the pistons and grease those cylinder walls up. It'd get compression fire up. That was all it needed. You know, so be aware of that. Just because one sounds like there's not no compression on any cylinder doesn't mean it's got major engine problems. It may just mean they cranked it and they moved it around enough to where, with it running rich all the time, it had washed the cylinder walls down. Sometimes they do that. Now, the plastic gauge I was talking about a while ago, if you check those new bearing clearances, you know, you can buy this stuff at the parts store. It doesn't cost very much. And you put a little piece of that plastic waxy string in there, and then you torque it. Then you take it off and you see how much it squished that plastic waxy string. And if it squishes it out, you know, see, that's got 1.5 thousandths of clearance. If you've got much more than 1.5 thousandths of clearance, what you're going to wind up with is some bottom end bearing noise or oil pressure loss. I put an engine, a crankshaft, one time in a Chevy Citation. Believe it or not, I was working at the Ford place when I did it. We got a crankshaft kit, and the bearings that came with that crankshaft didn't have enough. I mean, they had too much clearance. And this was the bearings that come with the crank kit on that particular one. We put it together, fired it up, and it had main bearing noise, and the oil pressure wasn't right. So I had to pull it. And I was changing the crankshaft with the engine in the car. And so that's a little tricky. You know, pull transmission and, you know, this kind of stuff out, and pull all the caps off, make sure they're kept in order, first you unhook the rods, then you take the mains, then you drop the crankshaft out, and then you put the crankshaft back up in there and put it all back together. Checking it with plastic gauge, we found out it had a little over 2 thousandths clearance, which it wasn't supposed to have that much, 1 to 1.5 thousandths, because all that engine would like to have. And so we sent it over to the machine shop, and those knotheads at the machine shop that had sold us the crankshaft kit actually machined the crankshaft down 9 thousandths and gave us a set of 20 thousandths undersized bearing, and still had too much clearance. And so finally the shop foreman says, let's just file the caps a little bit and put the clearance where it's supposed to be, and that's what we did, and that's how we let it go out of there. Sometimes you can just work yourself into the ground on something like that. They should have given us another crankshaft with another set of bearings, but they didn't do it. I wasn't the one calling the shots, you know, but anyhow. Camshaft and Valvetrain, you can actually determine what your lift is by measuring from side to side on one of these lobes, and then measure it from here to here, and you can do some math real easy and figure out how much the lift is. The duration has got to do with the shape of the lobe. And so, you know, if you got lift and duration, you have to do with how much the valve opens and how long it stays open, which is very important when it comes to performance. And I will tell you this too, this one guy was redoing one of those old Broncos, you know, the old ones like Pernelli Jones won the Baja with or whatever. And he put a Mustang engine in there with fuel injection, and it cammed it up, and it had a map sensor. Well, when you cam one up, the vacuum is low when it's idling. And that thing would puff black smoke, something terrible when it was idling, but whenever you were driving down the road or you had the engine speed up, it didn't run rich. Well, low vacuum means high load, means more fuel, means it runs rich. So basically to fix that one, what I did was I put a mass airflow kit on it, which comes with another engine controller, mass airflow sensors, some additional wires, that kind of thing. And so we managed to get that straightened out. That's pretty cool because they had a little adjustment over there where you could adjust that mass airflow, kind of like you're adjusting a carburetor or something. But you're just about going to have mass airflow if you're running a cam. You see, unless you're doing it with a carburetor. But anyway, some of these valves have got sodium cores to help them deal with heat, because valves run pretty hot, particularly exhaust valve. And you got these roller rockers now, which are very common. And those not roller rockers, but roller lifters. And you also got roller rockers on some of the overhead cam engines and stuff like that. Personally, I like having an engine with a camshaft in the block like this one, because there's less parts to fail. If you've got the overhead cam, you got an engine that breathes a little better, and it'll typically have higher compression, a little more power. But you've also got all those tensioners and sliders and all that stuff in there, and particularly if it's got variable valve timing. Matter of fact, one engine remanufacturer around here will sell you engines, like GM engines that came with the multiple cylinder, deal. They come with that deleted, and some of the Ford engines, they send those with the variable cam timing deleted, because it tends to be problematic and people just want to drive the vehicle without worrying about all that other stuff. But anyway, that's a little bit of a look like that. Push rods, whenever you're building an engine, it's always best if it's got hollow push rods, go ahead and replace the push rods, because there's usually a lot of cruddy crud down in there that you can't clean out of there. And push rods, if you look at the parts store, they only charge a couple of dollars for each push rod anyway. So it's not a big expenditure to replace all the push rods. Okay, overhead cams, dual overhead cams, that one there, you can tell that one there has got a variable valve timing thing going on. They've got little vanes in there, and it changes the relationship between the camshaft and the gear so you can manipulate the cam timing. And the first time I ever knew about anything like that going on was on some of the mid-90s Ford Contours, and they would close the exhaust valve a little bit early, and they got around needing EGR that way, because if you close the exhaust valve early, you trap some of the exhaust gas in there instead of having it recirculated, which, wasn't really such a bad idea. Okay, all right, overhead cam, that's a single overhead cam. Some of your overhead cams just have one gear out here, but they'll be geared together in there. That's how those Toyota 2.2s were. Alright, so heads are the hottest running part on the car, as far as the one part that doesn't move. And a lot of these heads nowadays, like even as far back as the old 4.6 liter that went in the Crown Victorias and the Lincolns and stuff, those vehicles, those cylinder heads were machined to something like aircraft specifications. And you couldn't just, a lot of times you couldn't get away with treating them like you would an older engine. They were pretty special on that. The 3-valve, that's the 3-valve, like what you saw in those Fords that have those big funky spark plugs. And a big funky long spark plug like the 3-valves had in the late 2000s on the Fords. This is going to sound really crazy, but if you've ever had trouble getting those out of there and having them pull the nose off when you're pulling them out, I wish I had one I could hold in my hand and show you. I wish I'd thought to put a picture on there. What we found out toward the end of my career when I was teaching was that you can get every one of those spark plugs out without any of them giving you trouble if you just jerk them out of there with an impact wrench. And every time we ever did it with an impact wrench, we never had the end come off a plug. If you screw it out of there slowly, no matter whatever else you do in preparation for that, you're usually going to have to use your special tool to get that nose out of there. We had to do that. And when I started snatching those things out of there with an impact wrench, you can get little 90-degree impact wrenches made by Ingersoll Rand and stuff where you get them in a tight area. You jerk them things out of there with an impact wrench, they'll come right on out. The disclaimer is, if you take any of the advice on these free videos I'm giving you and you don't like how it turns out, you got to remember this is a free video. So use your own judgment and don't try to act like, that somebody told you something. Don't blame it on me if you try to do something just because it worked for me. Everybody's got to find the way that best works for them. I even told my students that when I was teaching. But these valve springs can break. They need to be checked for squareness when you pull them out. The intake valve is typically the big one. The exhaust valve will be the small one. That's good to remember. There's your valve guides right there. Typically most of the work that's done on cylinder heads in the way of grinding valves and replacing valve guides and all that, most of the time that's done at a machine shop where they actually are set up to do that kind of thing. All right, driving the cams. A rubber belt is pretty cool because you don't have to lubricate it. Now, I'm going to say this right now, there are some engine platforms that have timing belts that are running wet, that have lubricant in there. Most of the time that's not the case. Most of the time you just put a seal here and you put a seal down there and you got a dry timing belt running. And so you got to know, it's really important that you know whether or not that is a free spinning engine. If it jumps time and it bends the valve, it's not a free spinning engine. They call it an interference engine. And if you're looking at the procedure for putting the timing belt back in, and they tell you to be really careful to make sure that you don't have the pistons kissing the valves, then you know right then that you need to be careful with that. Some of the guys, and I may have mentioned this in another video, nowadays will take those big heavy tie wraps that are about 2 feet long or 18 inches long or something, and when they're working on an engine that has a a 4-cylinder that all the pistons are coming straight up and down, or even a straight 6, they'll actually put a plastic wire tie in every spark plug hole. And then when you're turning that engine through, you can watch those tie wraps and you can tell where those pistons are. Well, if you're afraid you're going to damage the pistons, what you want to do is you want to go past top dead center on number 1 to where all of the pistons are down a little bit. And that way, whenever you're turning your camshafts and all, getting them lined up, put your belt on there, you know you're not going to be contacting pistons. Then you can actually turn the crankshaft back so that it's your top dead center number 1 and its companion and all that kind of thing. That's just something, that's a little trick that some people have done. I've actually got an engine calibration kit that's got some that I got from a tool company that works really well for finding TDC in a mechanical way. Some of these engines right here will have 100,000 mile timing belts on them. Anytime you're doing a timing belt, though, don't ever neglect, most of the time timing belt will come with these tensioners. And I like to replace the water pump while I'm in there and any of these bearings that I happen to see. And now these sliders, these nylon sliders, they like to crap out. So a timing chain nowadays mostly comes with those. A lot of these timing chains will have colored links that you're supposed to line up. On the timing belt, every so often you may run into a timing belt that's got a white stripe on it you're supposed to line up for the timing marks and all, but I hadn't seen a lot of that. I've seen it some on some vehicles, but I don't remember which ones. But anyway, here's another thing. A timing belt that's too tight, of this style right here or even that style right there, if you get that timing belt too tight, it'll make noise. Now there are round tooth timing belts and square tooth timing belts. I don't remember which one of them is the worst to do that, but I think it's the round tooth. You get it too tight and it's making a noise when you rev it up. Loosen the timing belt a little bit, you usually won't have it. If you look on my YouTube channel, there's a video where I actually let you hear what a timing belt is. If you look up, do a search for timing belt. If you look up for the timing belt being too tight, you can actually hear what a tight timing belt sounds like. Okay. Now, oil pumps can come in all kinds of flavors. These gerotor, this is a crescent style pump because it's got that immovable crescent part in between there. Vane pump, and this right here is a relief valve from a 6-liter, I think. And then right here you got these gerotor style pumps, and you got gear style pumps. If you ever took one of these pumps like this one here, and you stick that sump thing down in a thing of oil, and you got the the drive sticking off of it, where you can actually spin that oil pump with your fingers. If you spin it the way it pumps, you will be absolutely astonished by just spinning that thing with your fingers how much oil will come squirting out of that thing and go halfway across the shop. These things can move some oil in a big way, but in spite of the fact that an oil pump is positive displacement, it cannot produce pressure unless there is a relief valve that it's pushing against. Okay, so if the relief valve spring breaks or the relief valve sticks open, even though there's really nothing else wrong with the oil pump, you will not have oil pressure. And that's really important to remember that. I did a job one time working in a truck shop, and I took an engine down and put rings and bearings and all that kind of stuff in it. And when I put it all back together, there was nothing wrong with any of the clearances or anything, but the oil pressure was just a little bit low, but the guy didn't want to spend any more money on it. So I took the oil pump apart, and I pulled that little pin out and took the spring out and put some washers behind the spring to make the spring stiffer to give it more pressure on the relief valve. And the oil pressure came up and the truck was just fine. The guy used it for years like that. Most of the time, though, if you've got oil pressure loss, it's because you got some clearances somewhere. And if you pull the oil pump off, or even take the oil pressure sending unit out and put shop air pressure in the oil gallery, if you listen to where a lot of hissing is coming from, that's where your oil pressure is getting lost. And so be kind of careful with that, though, because if you got one of them oil filters on there and you put shop air on there, it may blow the oil filter off. If it's one of them thin metal oil filters, that are cheap. All right, driving the oil pump, sometimes they do it with the crankshaft. Sometimes they do it with the timing belt, by way of the crankshaft. Sometimes it's driven, through the distributor. A lot of times it is. Sometimes it's right on the nose of the crankshaft. And that's an oil pump. One time there was a guy that came in there, and he came walking in there to the shop when I was over at the college, and he said, I've got low oil pressure on my Ranger. I said, and I looked in there, I said, you got a little bit of sludge in there. You probably got your screen stopped up with crud, your oil pressure screen. You probably need to pull the pan off and clean that out. And that knothead went out there, and he put a pan under that truck, and he drained the oil out of it. And he took, while he had the drain plug out on that particular truck, he could shine a little pin light in there and see that oil screen, and he could see crap all over it. And he got some doggone spray of some kind and some, long coat hanger, and he cleaned all that crud off of that screen through the oil drain plug hole using a pin light. And when he got through, he flushed it out as good as he could, pouring stuff through there, and he put that drain plug back in, put oil in it, and he had oil pressure. He fixed it right out there in the grass. I thought that was something else. All right, so the oil galleries are pretty important to understand. Usually the last thing that gets oiled after everything else has been oiled is your valve train. A lot of the times your oil, on some of these engines, you'll have a little jet up underneath the bottom spraying oil on the bottom of the piston to try to help cool it off, and that's not very common, but you see it on some of your engines, the diesels and stuff particularly. This is the 1998 Chrysler 2.7 liter, which is, if you worked on a Sebring with one of these things in it and you've had to put a water pump on it or something, it makes you want to shoot whoever come up with this. These engines run good when they're running, but some of the stuff, there's a plastic housing that goes for the upper radiator hose. The thermostat's down there by the air conditioner on the side of the block, and the water pump is in here, driven by these chains. Now Ford's built some engines with water pumps in there too. But Chrysler was a little bit smarter because they fixed it so that there was a weep hole down here on the side of the block by the thermostat. If that weep hole clogged up, they had another one up here in the valley. And so whenever the water pump would start leaking, rather than letting it leak into the oil, it would either leak in that valley and go out the back, or it would leak out and drip behind the air conditioner compressor. It was pretty interesting. But this plastic housing that's not pictured right here where your upper radiator hose hooks up, that thing likes to crack and split, and it'll run, you'll see coolant running out just all over the place because it'll go into that valley, and then it runs out this big hole at the back of the valley and drips off the transmission and all that kind of thing. But I had worked on some of those. If you split a 4-cylinder in half, you get that. I mean, that's, so what, whoop-de-doo, Somebody that went to the trouble to do that probably had way too much time on their hands. Gaskets and seals are really important. You got to make sure you get good ones. You can buy cheap, crappy gaskets and have a cheap, crappy job, so make sure you get good quality gaskets. Also, when you're looking at your head gaskets, make darn sure that the holes are the same size as the ones that came off of there. You can have holes too big for the water jackets in that gasket, and it'll actually burn up the engine because the water is flowing through the head too fast to take the heat. Head gaskets can blow into the coolant, they can blow between, and they can actually get coolant into the cylinder, they can get compression into the coolant, they can get compression from side to side, they can leak oil, they can actually leak to the outside, and there's a bunch of different ways head gaskets can blow, so keep that in mind too. Alright, overhead cams got a high pressure oil feed through that gasket. On this one we worked on, they said it had a rear main seal that was bad. At a shop somewhere, they came in here, we put dye in there, we saw it coming from out from under there, we put a head gasket on that one, took care of it. Valve stem seals are going to make these deposits right here. Alright, so be careful about that. These intake valve stem seals are the ones that will be causing that problem. If you see that, these seals are bad, and you can usually replace them without pulling the motor down. This is some pictures from that thing I did the other day. Water pumps are not positive displacement pumps. But if there's too much space between here and here, like if they didn't press it on far enough, or if it's cavitated, you're going to have one that runs hot for that reason. Alright, water pump failures typically are going to be bearings. You'll see that little thing right there. And oil leaks can come from the splash or the sump area. And that's about all the time that we've got today. So I'm just going to let you guys go. And I really appreciate you coming by. I was just about done anyway. I've only got a slide or two left. But I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you remembered some of your own stories that you can share. Type me a note. We'll talk to y'all later.